Before we get into the video, I'd just like to say something. A fellow YouTuber named Chatterhat had his house completely destroyed in a storm. No one was hurt, but the house is completely gone. He started a GoFundMe, and if you have any money you could spare, it would be greatly appreciated. Any little bit helps, even if it's only a penny. Thank you. On to the video. Hey, everybody! My name is Game Gear Gabby, and today I'll be going through the top 3 worst Pokemon of each generation. Now, before I go over these terrible Pokemon, here's a couple ground rules I want to go over. 1, when I say every generation, I'm only going through generations 1 through 7, due to me not giving 2 shits about generations 8 or 9. 2, I won't be counting any sorts of forms, so no Alolan forms and no colors, nothing like that. There is one exception, but we'll get to that. 3, when I say all Pokemon, I mean all Pokemon lines. I'll only be representing lines via their final evolution, lest that line has multiple final evolutions. 4, I will let literally anything influence the rankings, and that includes the shows, since I feel like they're an important enough part of Pokemon as a whole to be taken into consideration. Not to mention, yes, I have seen all the shows from Gen 1 to 7. 5, I'll be doing the generations out of order, going from the generation with the least worst Pokemon to the generation with the worst Pokemon. Just remember, my order of the generations in this video does not reflect my thoughts on the generations as a whole. And finally, just remember, this is all my opinion. If I hate on a Pokemon you love, don't take it personally, and trust me, I hate a lot of popular Pokemon. Anyways, let's start the list with the generation that has the least egregious worst Pokemon. While Sun and Moon isn't a perfect pair of games, they do have a very solid lineup of Pokemon. While Gen 7 doesn't have my favorite lineup of Pokemon, it does have a very good lineup. There's not a single Pokemon below B tier in my opinion. That said, there's still some Pokemon that aren't as good as others, so let's talk about them. Alola number 3, Ribombee. Ribombee is by no means a bad Pokemon, but the competition is just way too stacked. While not a terrible fighter, she's just kinda uninteresting. We already had a bee-themed Pokemon, and I feel like they did better with that one. I also think her turning into a bee was kinda out of left field. I understand a lot of evolutions, especially in Alola, are pretty out of left field, but how does an animal go from a fly to a bee? In Ribombee's defense, I don't know how I would make a better evolution for Cutiefly, but maybe they could give Ribombee an evolution? I'm not sure. Either way, third worst Alolan Pokemon. Alola number 2, Comfey. Alola has a lot of Pokemon that feel more like props than anything. Cutiefly felt like a Pokemon just meant to be a decoration they decided to give an evolution, and Comfey continues that trend, except this time he doesn't have an evolution, which means 2 things. 1, there's less incentive to catch him, and 2, he's stronger by default, which is the main reason he lands at number 2. While his design is good on its own, what lands Comfey at number 2 is that he's just incredibly annoying to fight. He's faster than most Alolan Pokemon, has above average special defense. This is actually a trait shared by a Pokemon we'll see way later down the line, but with all the flaws raised tenfold. Alola number 1, Night Form Lycanroc. Now, don't get me wrong, I like Lycanroc's other forms, Dusk Form in particular being one of my favorite Alolan Pokemon. That said, I just hate the whole edgy werewolf cliche. I much prefer the much more accurate wolf. Oh, and of course he belongs to the edgy emo boy in the anime. For as good as the Gen 7 anime is, Nightform Lycanroc and everything related to him is just corny. And while I originally tolerated him due to him being a decent fighter, the anime shoots him all the way down to being the worst Alolan Pokemon. Gen 5 is a very good generation for Pokemon, with several slam dunks, including Hydreigon, Excadrill, Gothitelle, Scrafty, and my personal favorite, Chandelure. But no generation is without bad Pokemon, so here they are. Unova number 3, Basculin. One thing I really don't like is when Pokemon aren't cool and don't evolve. Basculin fits that description perfectly, being a basic fish who has absolutely nothing of note. The only cool thing about him is that he has 2 different colors, but aside from that, there's really nothing to talk about, so here it goes. Unova number 2, Alomomola. Alomomola is really annoying, not in the sense that fighting it is a nightmare, but in the sense that its stats just don't work with its moveset. Its basic attack is almost twice as high as its special attack, yet all but one of its water attacking moves it learns naturally are special. If you're gonna make one attack stat twice as high as the other, please make sure it's the right one. Thank you. Unova number 1, Watchog. While not the worst fighter, Watchog is one of the ugliest Pokemon designs from the first 5 generations, and while there have been worse since, this one still stands out and not in a good way. He's also just boring conceptually. He's just meant to stand guard. Might as well call him the bouncer Pokemon. Despite its flaws, I still have a soft spot for Generation 1, and for being the first generation, the lows aren't nearly as low as the highs are high. That said, said lows still do exist, so let's go over them. Kanto number 3, Raticate. I know a lot of people like this Pokemon, but I just find it mediocre. When Klefki was created, people's patience really started to get tested when it came to object Pokemon. But I feel like those people need to step back and realize that Gen 1's Pokemon designs really showed that it was a first game. On top of really boring Pokemon from a design standpoint, like a fire-breathing dragon, a mole that turns into 3 moles for some reason, Pokemon that can become any other Pokemon, and a fake Pokeball, there's a lot of designs that are literally just basic-ass animals or objects with, at most, some elemental powers. But I hate to break it to you, most Pokemon have elemental powers. Pokemon like these include Fearow, Pidgeot, Rhydon, Golem, Tauros, Kangaskhan, Magneton, Arcanine, Rapidash, Beedrill, Butterfree, Vileplume, Venomoth, Seadra at the time, Kingler, Cloyster, Dugong, Muck, Arbok, Golbat, Persian, the 2 guys after this, and Raticate. I got that first try! The one thing that keeps him in C tier and not D tier is that him and his protege can learn some pretty good moves for being obtainable so early. Hyper Fang is low-key busted, though I really wish they'd give that move to a better Pokemon. Kanto number 2, Seaking. Everything that applies to Raticate applies to Seaking, except it doesn't have any unique attacks and its stats are worse. The only memories I have of Seaking are actually from Goldeen, and those are getting it from the Master Ball, and if that doesn't sound like a particularly good memory, trust me, it's not. Kanto number 1, Farfetch'd. Take literally everything I've said about Raticate and Seaking and make it a duck. We already had 2 much better duck Pokemon, and yet they insisted on making this. At least with Raticate, he has some neat dex entries and some good early game moves, and at least with Seaking, his pre-evolution has some cool appearances in both the show and Smash Bros, but with Farfetch'd, he has literally nothing. The guy only appears in the Safari Zone, so when you can get him, not only are you going to have at least 5 Pokemon on your team, the last slot is probably going to be saved for a much better Pokemon in this area, like Rhyhorn, Execute, or Chansey. Not only are those Pokemon much cooler, but they also have much better stats, with each of them having a base stat total of 355, 325, and 450 respectively. You want to know what Farfetch'd's base stat total is? 372. Granted, that is higher than Rhyhorn and Execute, but they can both evolve, and when they do, their stats get massively boosted and absolutely steamroll Farfetch'd. Now, in his defense, they did eventually make Sirfetch'd, who both looks and plays much better. In fact, he's my 3rd favorite Gen 8 Pokemon, right behind Rillaboom and Hatterene. But keep in mind, that took 7 generations, so it's clear that even Game Freak forgot about Farfetch'd. Do I think he deserved to be forgotten? No. Do I think he had potential? Absolutely. Did Sirfetch'd reach that potential? 100%. But that was in Gen 8, and we're only talking about Gens 1 through 7, so unfortunately Farfetch'd has to be the worst Kanto Pokemon. Gen 4 is probably the generation with the best Pokemon, housing absolute bangers like Empoleon, Garchomp, Magnezone, Dusknoir, Lopunny, Lucario, Abomasnow, Porygon Z, the best legendary with Regigigas, and my single favorite Pokemon of all time with Torterra. That said, it also houses some of the worst legendaries in my opinion, but before them is Sinnoh number 3, Pachirisu. Every single generation had to have a Pikachu ripoff, and while some are pretty good, some are patchy Risu. One thing I feel like Game Freak didn't get is that the best part of Pikachu was that if you wanted to, you could keep the adorable electric rodent, or you could evolve it into an absolute powerhouse. That said, every single Pikachu ripoff after Pikachu didn't have an evolution, which sucks because I feel like some of them, particularly Togedemaru, could have had really cool evolutions. But that's not the only problem with Pachirisu. He's an absolute joke in terms of stats, making it feel like he was supposed to have an evolution, but just didn't for some reason. Sinnoh number 2, Cresselia. Cresselia is one of the most nothing legendaries of all time. It doesn't have anything special about it, it honestly feels like it was supposed to be in a duo, but they just didn't give it a counterpart. Normally being a nothing Pokemon would put it in C tier, but when you're a legendary Pokemon, it's much less excusable. Sinnoh number 1, Arceus. I know a lot of people really like Arceus, but I just can't get by his existence. I hate the concept of a god, and that especially applies to Pokemon. Lots of Pokemon are concepts of things like land, time, space, life, death, order, emotions, weather, daylight cycles, etc. So having one Pokemon that's just God personified really gets under my skin. I personally am agnostic, leaning on atheist, and think the universe being created is all explainable via science, so to have people come up with the objectively lazy answer of it was created by an omnipotent god is just a freaking cop-out. That said, when Pokemon already has answers to why the world exists, having one Pokemon that's above all of them just feels so thrown in. Especially since one thing I love about the legendaries is thinking about how they interact with each other, and what that can cause. Trust me, there are Pokemon that are worse, but none that frustrate me more than Arceus. So, worse Sinnoh Pokemon. Oh boy, Kalos, my least favorite of the first 7 generations dex-wise. It doesn't have a bad lineup of Pokemon, but it just doesn't have as many highs as every other generation. To give you a comparison, the generation with the second least amount of Pokemon in S tier or higher is Gen 2 with 11. This generation? It has 5 S tiers, not even enough to make a full team. What a joke. And it also has some decently low lows, but unfortunately, all 3 of them are hot takes, so prepare yourself. Kalos number 3, Carbink. Carbink is on Onix levels of great design with embarrassingly low stats. While it does have arguably better stats than Onix, Onix can evolve. This Pokemon can't. They're also just okay from a design standpoint, just being Diancie subjects, so they're essentially just Peach's Toads but less competent. I watched the Diancie movie and the Carbinks really didn't do anything in that movie, basically just being mindless lemmings. My solution to fixing Carbink is to make it evolve into Diancie, which might make Diancie feel less important, but it would also make Carbink more valuable. Kalos number 2, Dedenne. Much like Pachirisu, Dedenne is a boring Pikachu ripoff. I would understand if some people actually kinda liked Dedenne due to his appearance in the show, but in my opinion, Dedenne was extremely overshadowed by Zygarde, who is a much better Pokemon, my favorite of Kalos actually. He's also just a boring design, with the only notable part being his tail, making him probably the most boring design in Gen 6. That said, he's not the worst Pokemon in Gen 6. Kalos number 1, Greninja. This is an extremely controversial placement. Listen, I tolerated Greninja at first. He was a pretty decent mon, if not a bit weak for how he looked. That said, I was really tired of ninja Pokemon at this point. While their first attempt at a ninja Pokemon was great, they kept trying over and over and over, and by the time we got to Greninja, I was pretty much done. I also wish he at least tried to be both a ninja and a frog, but no, just ninja. And then he got into Smash Bros, and that was the final nail in the coffin. He's one of my least favorite characters in Smash Bros, and easily the most forgettable. I just hate this Pokemon, and I know a lot of people love him, but I just don't get it. Gen 3 is easily my second favorite generation, right behind Kanto, having the second best map right behind Kanto, and a solid selection of Pokemon. That said, it also has quite a few duds, one being particularly egregious. But before we get to her... Hoenn number 3, Volbeat and Illumise. We got a double here. Gen 3 introduced the concept of double battles, so it had quite a few Pokemon duos. One of the worst examples being Volbeat and Illumise. Their main gimmick is that they can learn Tail Glow, which raises their special attack by 3 stages, the only move to raise anything by 3 stages. That might sound amazing, but there's a problem. Their type was physical in Gen 3, and back then, if your type was physical, all of your moves were physical. So either you didn't get the buff of Tail Glow, or you didn't get any stab on your moves. Not only that, but Illumise is even worse than Volbeat since he can't even learn Tail Glow. That's his defining feature, and they just didn't give it to Illumise. These two are completely useless. Oh, and speaking of completely useless, Hoenn number 2, Plusle and Minun. We got another twofer. Plusle and Minun are much more catered to double battling, with Minun learning a lot of support moves like Helping Hand, and Plusle being the attacker. It's kind of fun to battle, I guess, but to use, these Pokemon are useless, especially in single battles. If I were to pick one over the other, I'd pick Plusle for his extra attack and speed, but realistically, I wouldn't put either of them on my team. Especially considering some of the other Pokemon you can use instead, especially considering this generation has the most S-tier Pokemon with a whopping 25. Hoenn number 1, Latias. Speaking of tiers, here's our first of only 3 F-tier Pokemon with Latias. And you might be wondering why she isn't in a duo with Latios. And that's because Latios is in B-tier. Well, why is Latios in B-tier but Latias in F-tier? She kissed Ash. Listen, human and Pokemon relationships are fine, and I'm pretty sure they're even canon in some games. That said, Latias is a legendary Pokemon, so I would assume she's pretty old. Ash, on the other hand, is 10. FBI, we got her. People call Mr. Mime the pedophile Pokemon, when this Pokemon is right here. Yes, Hypno kidnapped a child, but it never said anything about him fucking molesting it. All jokes aside, Latias and Latios are also just kind of boring design-wise. I really wish instead of them being roaming legendaries, they were legendaries you had to fight in a double battle. Either way, a several thousand-year-old legendary beast trying to get with the 10-year-old definitely deserves to be an F-tier. Gen 2, Gen 2, Gen 2. Oh, how I have a love-hate relationship with you. Listen, as a sequel to Gen 1, it's great, but as a generation on its own, man, this one aged poorly. Even more poorly than Gen 1 in my opinion. The evolutions to previous Pokemon are great, like the new Evolutions, Scizor, Blossom, Blissey, Slowking, Politoed, Porygon 2, Steelix, and Hitmontop, but the new Pokemon are just so hit or miss. Some of them are good, like Mantine, Lugia, Wobbuffet, the roaming legendaries Magcargo, Octillery, Forretress, Ursaring, Granbull, Xatu, Togetic, Ariados, Donphan, Azumarill, Heracross, Miltank, the new starters, aside from Typhlosion, Ho-Oh, Houndoom, Tyranitar, Skarmory, and Ampharos. But we also have a lot of painfully mid Pokemon, like Girafarig, Jumpluff, Murkrow, Aipom, and Celebi. And then you have outright bad Pokemon, such as Johto number 3, Qwilfish. Remember what I was talking about way earlier in this list while talking about Basculin, about how I don't like Pokemon who aren't cool and don't evolve? Well, consider Qwilfish. Remember the other thing I was talking about with Pokemon who are just basic objects and animals? Consider Qwilfish. Qwilfish is just a pufferfish. As someone who doesn't really like pufferfish in most games, aside from you, Fugu, you can stay, Qwilfish really doesn't do the animal any favors since he's really boring. The most interesting thing he does is lay down spikes, but if you want a Pokemon related to dangerous things to step on, Stunfisk is right there. Incredibly boring Pokemon who doesn't have an interesting design, doesn't have good stats, doesn't have good moves, and doesn't evolve. Speaking of which, Johto number 2, Unown. This Pokemon is a collector's worst nightmare. You're telling me there are 28 of these things? Now, Unown is bad enough on its own for the same reason as Qwilfish, but what puts it this low is 3 factors. 1, boring concept and boring execution. 2, they threatened to have some sort of secret purpose that they just never fulfilled. And 3, they transformed into Entei that kidnapped Ash's mom. Horrible Pokemon, horrible design, horrible moveset, horrible stats, horrible lore, horrible use, horrible presence in the anime, horrible everything, F-tier Pokemon. Johto number 1, Stantler. Speaking of horrible everything, the final Pokemon on our list is Stantler. Remember all the way back at the beginning of the list when I talked about Comfey, how the fact that it's a non-evolving Pokemon made its stats higher by default, making it incredibly annoying to fight? Well, all of that applies to Stantler. He's much faster than your team by default, meaning he can't run away, and he'll always go first, and combined with his moveset, that makes fighting him a nightmare. He can use Stomp to make your Pokemon flinch, Hypnosis to make your Pokemon sleep, and Confuse Ray to, well, confuse your Pokemon. It is infuriating to fight, and that makes me really glad that there's not a single Drainer in Johto who uses him, since they find him just as repulsive as I do. Horrible Pokemon, F-tier, get it off my screen. Ribombee, Comfey, Lycanroc Knight, Raticate, Carbink, Pachirisu, Dedenne, Greninja, Seaking, Farfetch'd, Qwilfish, Cresselia, Basculin, Alomomola, Volbeat and Illumise, Plusle and Minun, Arceus, Watchog, Unown, Stantler, and Latias. Thank you all so much for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, join the Discord, etc. Stay fruity, queens, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye!